Hi everybody, today is Monday, December 7th. My name is Will, and these are my thoughts. A lot of my videos and posts recently have been centered around my new book, which is called Seamless Transition and is available for pre-order now. And we're still in the process of getting it all edited and whatnot, and we're still hoping to put it out by fall of next year. But in the meantime, I have gotten a couple of questions about what the book is actually about. And rather than just telling you that directly, because I think that kind of defeats the purpose of having a book in the first place, I thought it might be good to give a little bit more information on the background of the book itself. So this video will be the first in a 3-part series on the stories that inspired Seamless Transition. And we're not really doing them in any particular order, but just kind of the way that it shook out goes from today, which is probably the least dramatic of the 3, to slightly more tea being spilled, to just a full-on national ordeal. But to give a little bit of background on the background, the book is called Seamless Transition, and it's called that for a reason. It deals with how power and prestige are passed on from one generation to the next, and whether or not there's actually a healthy way to accomplish that. And especially in our current political landscape, I feel like these are pretty good questions to be asking. But thankfully, this book is not about politics. It is instead about college football coaches. And the first story that inspired Seamless Transition comes from Austin, Texas. In the mid-2000s, Texas were really good. They won a national championship with Vince Young in 2005, won the Rose Bowl in 2008, and then lost in the national championship game in 2009 to my Alabama Crimson Tide. And the guy at the helm for all of those seasons is named Mack Brown. He's currently the head coach at North Carolina, but was at Texas for about 15 years. And by pretty much all accounts, Mack Brown is a college football coaching legend. He took over a Texas program that had been wallowing in mediocrity for a few years, especially by their standards, and got them back up to being a program that won 10 games for 10 years in a row. But by the 2010s, Texas had already had a couple of run-ins with a phenomenon that pretty much any program that has won a national championship in the last 15 to 20 years is accustomed to, which is other teams poaching your coaches. I'm an Alabama fan, and I can tell you, even though we see it pretty much every year, it never gets any less annoying. And I will tell you that having done a lot of research for this book, nothing motivates college football coaching hiring quite like the threat of having your assistant coaches taken. After losing coach Dwayne Aquina, who was the defensive coordinator for the 2005 national championship team, they lost Gene Chizik to Iowa State, who had been their co-defensive coordinator. And it took them a while to find a semi-long-term replacement, which ended up being a guy named Will Muschamp. If that name sounds familiar, it's probably because he was recently fired as the head coach of South Carolina. Muschamp had been a position coach and a defensive coordinator under Nick Saban, both at LSU and with the Dolphins. And then he was the defensive coordinator at Auburn. And all of this was before he even hit 40. By the time he got to Texas, he was one of the hottest coaching prospects in the entire country, and he wasted no time in turning the Longhorns' defense around. Muschamp, Brown, and Texas racked up back-to-back BCS appearances in 12-win seasons in 08 and 09. And by the time the 09 season ended, a lot of teams around the country were starting to look at Muschamp. And maybe even more importantly than that, there were already some discussions about Mack Brown's future at Texas. He was in his late 50s, and really didn't have anything more to accomplish in the sport. And just to make things that much spicier, Texas followed up their 2009 national championship game appearance with a 5-7 season in 2010. Definitely not the way you want to ease any concerns about your future. But to that end, Texas had already made a pretty important move. With even the possibility that Mack Brown might leave still out there, and one of the hottest assistant coaches in the country right there in their backyard, Texas decided to just take any risk out of the situation at all. They made a pretty unprecedented choice and named Will Muschamp the coach in waiting at Texas. And what that basically meant was, whenever Mack Brown decided to retire or leave under whatever circumstances, Will Muschamp would take over. And in theory, it seemed pretty great, if only because it eliminated the possibility of Texas having to do a coaching search. They wouldn't have to lose yet another assistant to another program's prying eyes. And as he's been interviewed about it recently, Muschamp said that he jumped at the offer as soon as he heard it. And why wouldn't he at that point? Texas was one of the premier programs in the country. For somebody who'd worked for most of his professional life building up to a moment like that, of course he took it. It seemed like a sure thing, a win-win for everybody involved. and it might have been, except for one thing. There wasn't an end date. Nobody had any idea when any of this was supposed to actually happen. The transition happening at all was contingent on Mack Brown leaving, and he didn't want to leave. And as he's talked about it more recently, Mack Brown says that the whole coach in waiting thing was a mistake, primarily for that reason. It ended up not being very fair to either of them. There was an expectation now that it was sort of in Mack Brown's job description to make way for Will Muschamp at some point. That's not a great sell to recruits if everybody in the sphere thinks that you're leaving soon. And for Will Muschamp, it's kind of a letdown to have this big announcement only to find out later that it doesn't really mean anything. And eventually, he got tired of waiting. While all this was happening, another program further east was kind of falling apart and in need of a steady hand to guide them forward. One of the biggest programs in the country, Florida, cast their gaze upon Muschamp to try and replace Urban Meyer. After meeting with their AD, Will Muschamp accepted the head coaching job at Florida, and who can blame him? He may have had a job lined up at Texas, but who knew when that was going to happen? And if you have a sure thing from another top program, why wouldn't you take that? Now, in hindsight, we can look back and see Will Muschamp's Florida tenure and then Charlie Strong's tenure at Texas and say, I don't really know if anybody won here. Mack Brown ended up staying in Texas for another 3 years. So did they really expect Will Muschamp to stay that long? And if he had, would he have fared any better than Charlie Strong? Now, if you look at the records of these two programs, Florida and Texas, in the aftermath of this whole ordeal, you sort of see that there might have been some institutional issues that underlined a lot of this coaching drama. Maybe it wasn't Charlie Strong's fault after all. But regardless of any of that, if there's any lesson that we can take away from this whole situation, it's that if you're going to make big sweeping change, and if you're going to announce it beforehand, you need to have a plan for what comes after. I still think this was a decent idea, although the execution was pretty terrible. With all of the ego, prestige, emotion involved, there needed to be a stricter plan in place for what was going to happen. And from that, I think we can surmise that step one in creating a seamless transition is having a plan. Because if you don't, things can fall apart pretty quickly. And as we'll learn next week, some feelings can get pretty hurt in the process. I'm Will, those are my thoughts, and I'll see you guys next Monday.